The morning shift began like any other aboard the UHS Valiant, with crew members moving through their routines and systems humming their familiar songs. Commander Jake Morrison sat in his quarters reviewing reports when the communication alert sounded. He tapped the screen and saw Admiral Henry Cole's face appear, the old man's expression more grave than usual. The Admiral wasted no time with pleasantries and simply said that New Terra had gone silent 3 months ago, and Morrison's ship was being assigned to investigate. The transmission ended and Morrison felt a cold weight settle in his stomach because colonies did not just go silent. The journey to New Terra took 2 weeks, through hyperspace, and Morrison spent most of that time reading everything he could find about the colony. 50,000 people had called it home, families who had traveled across the stars to build something new. There were farmers and teachers and engineers, people who wanted to start fresh on a world where the sky was purple and 3 moons hung in the night. The last transmission from New Terra had been routine, a weekly status report that mentioned nothing unusual. Then silence. Chief Science Officer Lisa Bennett worked constantly during the journey, checking and rechecking the sensor arrays. She was a quiet woman who rarely spoke unless she had something important to say, and Morrison trusted her judgment completely. She told him that the equipment was functioning perfectly and that they would have answers soon. But her eyes showed worry because she knew as well as Morrison did that 3 months of silence meant something terrible had happened. When the Valiant dropped out of hyperspace at New Terra's coordinates, the crew expected to see the colony's lights scattered across the planet's surface like stars brought down to Earth. Instead, they saw nothing. The sensor operator, a young man named Paul Griffin, stared at his screens with confusion clear on his face. He reported that the planet was there, and the atmosphere was intact, but there were no signs of life, no power signatures, no radio signals, nothing at all. Morrison ordered the ship to move closer and established a standard orbit around New Terra. Through the viewports, the planet looked peaceful, the purple sky and green oceans exactly as described in the colonist reports, but as they descended lower, the truth became visible. The colony sites were empty, not destroyed but erased. Where there should have been buildings and roads and parks, there was only bare ground. It looked as if someone had taken a giant eraser and removed every trace of human presence. Bennett ran her scans repeatedly because she could not believe what the data was telling her. The ground showed no signs of conventional weapons, no blast craters or radiation burns from nuclear attacks. Instead, there was a strange molecular disruption, as if the buildings and everything in them had simply ceased to exist at the atomic level. She had never seen anything like it in 20 years of service. Morrison asked if this could be some kind of natural phenomenon, and Bennett shook her head, her voice steady as she explained that nature did not work with such precision. The landing party suited up and took a shuttle down to what had been New Terra's capital city. Morrison led the team personally because he needed to see this with his own eyes. They landed where the central plaza should have been and stepped out onto smooth ground that showed no indication that thousands of people had walked there just months before. Pilot Amy Sullivan walked a grid pattern with her scanner, searching for anything that might tell them what happened. She found nothing. Not even bones or ash, just emptiness. Then Bennett called out that she had detected something in the upper atmosphere, and the team returned to the shuttle immediately. Back aboard the Valiant, they tracked the signal to a recording buoy that was barely functional, its systems damaged by some kind of energy discharge. The technical crew worked for 6 hours to extract the data, and when they finally succeeded, Morrison gathered his senior officers to watch the playback. The footage was brief and chaotic. It showed the colony from a civilian's camera, people going about their daily activities in what looked like a marketplace. Children played while adults conducted business and everything seemed normal. Then the sky darkened and massive ships descended through the clouds, vessels larger than anything humanity had ever built. The ships were angular and black, covered in patterns that hurt to look at. They made no sound in the recording. Energy beams swept across the colony, not explosive but erasure in visible form. Buildings vanished where the beams touched them, and people disappeared as if they had never existed. There were no screams in the recording because it happened too fast for anyone to react. The camera fell to the ground and captured a final image of one of the alien ships hovering overhead before the recording ended. The entire attack had lasted less than 5 minutes. Morrison ordered the buoy secured and all data copied to multiple secure locations. Bennett analyzed the ships frame by frame but found no matches in any human database. These aliens were unknown to humanity, a species that possessed technology far beyond current human capabilities. Lieutenant Daniel Carter, the ship's intelligence officer, pointed out that the attack showed no signs of communication attempts or warnings. The aliens had simply arrived, erased the colony, and left. The return journey to Earth felt longer than the outward trip. Morrison spent hours writing his report, trying to find words adequate to describe what they had found. He recommended immediate military mobilization and increased patrols along all colony borders. He also recommended that humanity prepare for the possibility of war, because this was clearly not an accident or misunderstanding. This was deliberate extermination. When the Valiant docked at Earth Station, Morrison went directly to Defense Command headquarters. Admiral Cole met him in a secure briefing room along with a dozen other high-ranking officers and government officials. Morrison presented his findings and played the recovered footage. The room fell into heavy silence as the recording ended. Some of the officials looked sick while others looked angry, but all of them understood the implications. A politician whose name Morrison did not catch suggested attempting diplomatic contact and finding a peaceful solution. Admiral Cole let the man finish speaking before responding in a voice cold as space itself. The Admiral said that 50,000 humans had been erased without warning or mercy, that this was not a situation for diplomacy. He said that humanity would find these aliens and humanity would respond with every weapon at its disposal. The politician started to object, but Cole cut him off, stating that the time for debate had ended when New Terra went silent. Morrison left the briefing and returned to his ship. The crew was being given shore leave, but Morrison knew they would not be on Earth long. War was coming, a war unlike anything humanity had fought before. He stood in the observation deck and looked down at Earth, at the blue and green world that held billions of human lives. Somewhere out in the darkness, aliens existed who believed they could erase humanity without consequence. Morrison knew with absolute certainty that they would learn otherwise, that humanity would teach them the cost of such arrogance in fire and blood and vengeance without end. The war machine of Earth woke from its long sleep like a giant stirring after decades of rest. Admiral Cole stood in the war room deep beneath Defense Command and watched as factory after factory came online across the solar system. The screens showed production lines that had been mothballed since the last conflict now roaring back to life. Assembly robots moving with purpose as they began building instruments of destruction. Mars shipyards lit up first, then Luna's manufacturing centers, then the orbital stations around Jupiter and Saturn. Humanity was preparing to do what it did best when threatened, and that was to fight back with everything it had. Dr. Karen Phillips led the scientific team working around the clock to understand the alien technology. She had analyzed the radiation signature from New Terra hundreds of times, running simulations and tests until her eyes burned from staring at screens. The signature was unique, a type of energy emission that did not match anything in human physics databases. But Phillips was brilliant and stubborn, and she refused to accept that something could not be understood. After 3 weeks of constant work, she cracked the code and developed scanners that could detect this specific radiation across vast distances. The scanners could track the aliens wherever they went, turning their own technology into a beacon that would lead humanity right to them. The first scans of nearby space revealed disturbing information. The radiation signatures appeared in 17 different locations, each one a former colony world of various developing species. Intelligence Officer Daniel Carter took a team to investigate the closest site, and what they found made his blood run cold. The planet had been home to a species of peaceful aquatic beings who had just achieved basic spaceflight. Every trace of them was gone, erased just like New Terra. Carter's team found damaged recording equipment floating in orbit and recovered enough data to see the same black angular ships, the same erasure beams. This was not an isolated attack on humanity, but a pattern of systematic extermination. Carter went deeper into uncharted space, his small stealth ship designed to avoid detection. He spent weeks gathering information, intercepting alien communications and mapping their territory. He learned that the aliens called themselves the Zarkoni Collective, and that they considered themselves the supreme power in this region of the galaxy. They had been eliminating any species they deemed a potential future threat for over 2 centuries. The Zarkoni believed that only they deserved to reach for the stars, and that all others were pests to be exterminated before they could become dangerous. Carter recorded everything and sent encrypted messages back to Earth, each one adding to humanity's knowledge of their enemy. Meanwhile, General Marcus Webb oversaw the construction of the fleet that would carry humanity's response. Webb was a career military man who had spent 40 years preparing for conflicts that never came, and now he poured all that experience into building a force designed for one purpose. The ships being constructed were not exploration vessels or diplomatic cruisers, but warships, pure and simple. Each one was armed with weapons that pushed the boundaries of human technology, and some that went beyond those boundaries into experimental territory. The design teams worked with controlled desperation, knowing that every day of delay was another day the Zarkoni might strike again. Lead engineer Gary Nash created plasma lance batteries that could generate temperatures matching the core of stars, weapons that would burn through any known shielding. Weapons specialist Victoria Hunt developed kinetic bombardment systems that accelerated tungsten rods to relativistic speeds, turning simple metal into planet-killing weapons. And deep in a classified facility on Europa, a team led by physicist Alan Cooper worked on something called Project Hellstorm, a weapon so powerful that only a handful of people knew it existed. Lieutenant Commander Amy Sullivan trained the pilots who would fly humanity's new striker craft. The pilots were all volunteers, and many of them came from colonies near New Terra, people who had lost friends or family in the attack. Sullivan pushed them hard because she knew that hesitation in combat meant death. The training was brutal and realistic, using simulations based on everything Carter had learned about Zarkoni tactics. The pilots learned to fly in attack patterns that seemed chaotic, but were actually precisely coordinated, overwhelming enemy defenses through sheer unpredictability. Sullivan told them repeatedly that they were not just pilots but humanity's sword, and they needed to cut deep and true. Resources flowed from every corner of human space toward the war effort. Mining operations on asteroids doubled their output, processing raw materials into ship hulls and weapon components. Agricultural worlds increased food production to feed the workers building the fleet. Scientific research stations redirected their efforts toward military applications, turning theoretical research into practical weapons. The entire human civilization bent itself toward a single goal, and that goal was to make the Zarkoni regret they had ever encountered humanity. Dr. Phillips made another breakthrough when she successfully created a working model of Zarkoni shields based on recovered sensor data. The shields were indeed powerful, but they had a fundamental weakness. They were designed to disperse energy over a wide area. The plasma lances would concentrate energy into such a tight beam that the shields would simply overload and fail. Phillips presented her findings to Admiral Cole, who smiled for the first time since New Terra. The Admiral understood immediately that this gave humanity a critical advantage because the Zarkoni had grown comfortable with their technological superiority and would not expect a younger species to counter their defenses so effectively. 6 months after the Valiant returned, with news of New Terra's destruction, the fleet was ready. 200 warships of various classes filled Earth's orbital space, the largest military force humanity had ever assembled. Admiral Cole walked through the flagship UHS Retribution, inspecting the crew and systems personally. The ship was massive, bristling with weapons and armored with the latest composite materials. Its bridge was a marvel of tactical coordination, with displays showing every ship in the fleet and their status. Cole sat in the command chair and felt the weight of what was about to happen. The crews of all 200 ships gathered virtually for Cole's address. The Admiral appeared on screens across the fleet, his aged face showing the determination of someone who had made a difficult decision and would see it through. He spoke plainly and without grand rhetoric. He said that the Zarkoni had shown humanity no mercy and had erased 50,000 innocent lives without warning or remorse. He said that humanity's response would be proportional to that crime. He said that they were not going to war for conquest or resources, but for justice and survival. He said that the Zarkoni would learn what it meant to threaten humanity, and they would learn it in a way they would never forget. The fleet prepared to depart, running final systems checks and loading the last supplies. Families gathered at viewing stations to watch the ships leave, knowing that many of those aboard might not return. Children waved at the screens while parents held them tight. The fleet began to move, 200 warships accelerating toward the hyperspace jump point in perfect formation. On Earth, Admiral Cole stood alone in his office and looked at a photograph of New Terra taken before the attack. The purple sky and happy colonists frozen in a moment of peace that would never come again. He placed the photograph in his desk drawer and closed it gently. Then he turned to his console and gave the order that started the war. The fleet jumped to hyperspace and disappeared, carrying with them humanity's rage and determination. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, the Zarkoni waited unknowing of the storm that was coming for them. They had erased a human colony believing there would be no consequences. They were about to discover how wrong they were. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Thalos system, like ghosts materializing from darkness. Captain Nicole Harper stood on the bridge of the UHS Thunderstrike and watched as her tactical display populated with enemy contacts. Intelligence had been correct because the Zarkoni mining colony of Thalos 4 was defended by 36 warships, vessels that gleamed with a dark metallic sheen that seemed to absorb light. Harper felt her heart rate increase, but her hands remained steady on the command console. She had trained for this moment for 6 months, and before that, she had spent 15 years in the fleet preparing for combat that never came. Now it was here and she was ready. Admiral Cole's voice came through the fleet communication channel from the Retribution, calm and clear. He gave the order that every captain had been waiting for, and the fleet moved forward in attack formation. The Zarkoni ships detected the human presence immediately and began maneuvering into defensive positions around the planet. Harper watched as the alien vessels activated their shields, energy fields that shimmered like heat waves in the vacuum of space. The Zarkoni had been the dominant military power in this region for centuries, and they moved with the confidence of a force that had never known defeat. The first Zarkoni shots came from their lead battleship, massive energy beams that lanced across the distance between the fleets. The beams struck the UHS Defender, and the ship's shields flared bright as they absorbed the impact. Warning lights lit up on Harper's display as damage reports came in from other ships. The Zarkoni weapons were powerful, designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer force, but humanity had studied the recovered data from New Terra and other attack sites, and the fleet's shields had been specifically configured to handle this type of energy weapon. Harper gave her orders, and the Thunderstrike broke formation, along with 15 other cruisers, spreading out in a pattern that looked random but was actually carefully calculated. The Zarkoni concentrated their fire on the main fleet, trying to destroy the larger capital ships first. It was a sound tactical decision, based on centuries of experience fighting species that used conventional warfare doctrines. But humanity did not fight conventionally because humanity had learned warfare through countless conflicts against itself, developing strategies born from desperation and innovation. The plasma lance batteries fired for the first time in actual combat. Harper watched as the targeting systems locked onto the nearest Zarkoni cruiser, and the weapons officer pressed the firing control. A beam of concentrated plasma, hotter than any star's surface, shot across space in a line too thin to see with the naked eye. It struck the Zarkoni shield, and for a fraction of a second the shield held. Then it overloaded exactly as Dr. Phillips had predicted, and the plasma lance burned through the hull like a torch through paper. The Zarkoni ship exploded in a brilliant flash that left after images on the view screens. The other human ships opened fire, and suddenly the space around Thalos 4 filled with plasma beams cutting through Zarkoni shields and hulls. The aliens had never encountered weapons that could generate such focused heat, and their defensive technology simply could not handle it. Explosions blossomed across the battlefield as ship after ship died. Harper allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the tactical display updated with new information. The Zarkoni were adapting faster than expected, their commanders shouting orders in their harsh language that the translation systems struggled to interpret. 3. Zarkoni battleships concentrated their fire on the UHS Defiant, and the human ship's shields began to fail. Under the sustained barrage, Harper watched helplessly as the Defiant's shield indicator dropped to 0, and enemy fire tore through its hull. The ship exploded in a massive detonation that registered on every sensor in the fleet. 400 crew members died in that instant, 400 people who had families waiting back home. Harper felt rage building in her chest, but she channeled it into cold determination. The Defiant's sacrifice would not be wasted. 2 more human vessels took critical damage as the Zarkoni rallied their forces. The UHS Guardian lost its primary weapons and began to drift, venting atmosphere from multiple hull breaches. The UHS Sentinel reported engine failure and could not maneuver. For a moment it seemed that the battle might turn against humanity. Then Commander Sullivan's striker wings hit the Zarkoni fleet from 3 different vectors simultaneously. The small attack craft were faster than anything the Zarkoni had faced before, their pilots using every trick Sullivan had taught them. The Zarkoni targeting systems were designed to track large capital ships, and they struggled to lock onto targets moving at such high speeds with such unpredictable patterns. Sullivan led her wing in a diving attack run that brought them within kilometers of a Zarkoni battleship's hull. She launched her missiles at point-blank range and pulled up so hard that the gravitational forces nearly made her black out. Behind her, the missiles struck home and the battleship's power core went critical. The other striker wings followed Sullivan's example, darting in and out of the Zarkoni formation like insects stinging a much larger predator. Missiles streaked through space, each one carrying a fusion warhead powerful enough to crack a mountain. The Zarkoni tried to adjust their tactics, but they were fighting a type of warfare they had never encountered. Their doctrine was built on large ships fighting in organized formations, trading fire until one side's defenses collapsed. Humanity fought with chaos and speed, using small units to create maximum damage while capital ships provided covering fire. Harper brought the Thunderstrike around for another attack run, her crew working with practiced efficiency. The weapons officer called out targets while the helmsman, a young man named Peter Walsh, kept them moving too fast for the Zarkoni to draw a solid lock. Harper ordered a full barrage and the Thunderstrike's plasma lances fired alongside conventional railguns and missile launchers. A Zarkoni destroyer tried to evade, but the weapons tracked it perfectly and the ship came apart. Under the combined assault, the battle had been raging for 40 minutes when the last Zarkoni ship attempted to flee the system. Admiral Cole gave a simple order over the fleet channel and every available weapon fired at once. The fleeing ship never made it to hyperspace, its engines failing under the concentrated fire. It drifted dead in space for a moment before secondary explosions tore it apart. The battle was over and humanity had won its first engagement with the Zarkoni. Not a single alien vessel had escaped to warn their homeworlds. Harper allowed her crew a moment to celebrate before ordering damage assessment. The Thunderstrike had taken hits but nothing critical. Around the fleet, other ships reported their status and the cost became clear. The Defiant was gone, the Guardian was crippled beyond field repair, and the Sentinel would need weeks in a shipyard. 8 other vessels had taken serious damage. But they had destroyed 3 dozen Zarkoni warships and now the real work would begin. Admiral Cole's face appeared on every screen in the fleet, his expression showing no triumph or joy. He ordered the fleet to take up bombardment positions around Thalos 4. Harper understood what was coming next because she had read the orders before. They left Earth. This was not just about winning battles, but about sending a message that would echo across the galaxy. The Zarkoni had erased New Terra without mercy or warning, and humanity's response would be equally merciless. The kinetic bombardment, systems activated and targeting solutions were calculated for every military installation, every mining facility, every command center on Thalos 4. The bombardment began and tungsten rods accelerated to relativistic speeds rained down on the planet below. Each rod hit with the force of a nuclear weapon, creating craters and shockwaves that could be seen from orbit. The bombardment continued for 2 hours until nothing remained on Thalos 4 that could support Zarkoni military operations. Harper watched the destruction on her screens and felt no satisfaction, only a cold certainty that this was necessary. The Zarkoni had to understand that erasing human colonies came with consequences beyond anything they had imagined. Humanity had declared its intentions in fire and fury, and now the Zarkoni would have to decide how to respond. As the fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace and return to base, Harper knew this was only the beginning. The war had started, and it would not end until one side or the other had been broken completely. She thought of New Terra and the 50,000 people who had died there, and she thought of the 400 crew members of the Defiant, who would never go home. Their deaths demanded justice, and humanity would deliver it no matter the cost. The news of Thalos 4's destruction reached the Zarkoni High Command within hours, and the reaction was immediate and violent. War Leader Thrax stood in the command chamber of their capital world and watched the recordings from the few escape pods that had been recovered. He saw human ships moving with precision and purpose, saw weapons that burned through shields that had protected Zarkoni fleets for generations, saw the systematic destruction of everything they had built on Thalos 4. For the first time in his long military career, Thrax felt something he had never experienced before, and that feeling was fear mixed with rage. The High Command convened immediately, and the debate was short because the Zarkoni had only ever known one response to threats. They would mobilize the Grand Fleet, a force of over 500 warships that represented the full military might of their civilization. This fleet had conquered dozens of worlds and eliminated countless species. The Zarkoni commanders believed that the humans had simply gotten lucky at Thalos 4, that their technology could not possibly match Zarkoni superiority. War leader Thrax was given command of the Grand Fleet and ordered to crush humanity so thoroughly that no other species would ever dare challenge Zarkoni dominance again. But humanity had not been idle. During the weeks it took the Zarkoni to gather their forces, intelligence officer Daniel Carter and his reconnaissance teams had mapped every major Zarkoni installation across their territory. The information flowed back to Earth, where Admiral Cole and his staff studied it carefully. They identified supply depots that fed the Zarkoni war machine, shipyards that built their vessels, and communication hubs that coordinated their military. Cole gave orders, and small human strike teams began moving into Zarkoni space like shadows. Captain Ben Turner led one of these covert operations teams aboard a stealth ship designed to avoid detection. Turner was a specialist in unconventional warfare, trained in tactics that regular military forces considered too risky or underhanded. His team infiltrated a major Zarkoni fuel depot on the edge of their territory, bypassing security systems that the aliens thought were impenetrable. Turner planted demolition charges with precision timing, and his team escaped just before the depot exploded. Millions of liters of fuel burned, and 36 Zarkoni ships found themselves stranded without the ability to refuel. Other teams struck simultaneously across Zarkoni space. Ammunition storage facilities exploded mysteriously, supply convoys disappeared without trace, communication satellites stopped functioning. The Zarkoni military command structure began experiencing delays and confusion as their logistics network fell apart piece by piece. Ships that were supposed to join the Grand Fleet found themselves unable to leave port because they lacked fuel or ammunition. Thrax raged at his subordinates, but the truth was becoming clear. Humanity was fighting a different kind of war than the Zarkoni had ever encountered. Despite the disruptions, Thrax managed to assemble a force of 300 warships, and he set course for the human colony world of Frontier Station. Intelligence had identified it as a major population center with 300,000 civilians. Thrax planned to do to Frontier Station exactly what humanity had done to Thalos 4, to erase it completely and force the humans to understand the cost of challenging the Zarkoni. His fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system with weapons charged and shields at maximum. The battle computers calculated firing solutions, and Thrax prepared to give the order to begin the bombardment. Then the defensive platforms opened fire, and Thrax's perfect plan fell apart. Frontier Station was protected by a network of automated weapon stations that humanity had positioned throughout the system during the weeks after Thalos 4. Each platform was controlled by advanced tactical computers that could coordinate with each other faster than any organic mind. The platforms had been waiting in stealth mode, invisible to Zarkoni sensors until they activated. The first barrage from the platforms destroyed 12 Zarkoni ships before Thrax even understood what was happening. The automated systems did not hesitate or feel fear. They simply calculated optimal firing solutions and executed them with mechanical precision. Plasma lances fired from dozens of angles simultaneously, overwhelming Zarkoni shields through sheer volume of coordinated fire. Thrax ordered his fleet to scatter and engage the platforms, but the weapon stations were small and heavily armored, designed specifically to survive in combat. Captain Nicole Harper had been promoted after her performance at Thalos 4 and given command of the defensive fleet station near Frontier Station. She watched from the bridge of the UHS Thunderstrike as the battle unfolded, waiting for the right moment to engage. Harper had studied every recording of Zarkoni tactics, and she knew they would try to regroup and concentrate their forces. She waited until the alien fleet began to form, up into their standard battle formation, and then she ordered her ships to attack. The human fleet hit the Zarkoni from behind, while the defensive platforms continued their assault from the front. The aliens found themselves caught in a crossfire with nowhere to retreat. Thrax tried to coordinate a response, but his communications were being jammed by human electronic warfare systems that Carter's intelligence teams had designed specifically to disrupt Zarkoni command frequencies. Ships received conflicting orders or no orders at all, and the formation began to fall apart. The battle lasted 6 hours and turned into a slaughter. The Zarkoni fought with desperate courage, but courage meant nothing against superior tactics and technology. Harper's ships moved through the enemy formation like predators, targeting command vessels and support ships. The defensive platforms never stopped firing, their ammunition reserves deep enough to sustain combat for days if necessary. One by one, the Zarkoni ships died, their hulls torn apart by weapons they could not effectively counter. Thrax's flagship, a massive battleship that had led the Zarkoni to victory in 100 conflicts, took hit after hit. The shields failed and plasma lances burned through the armor. Systems began exploding across the ship and Thrax knew he had lost. He ordered the surviving ships to retreat, but only a handful managed to escape, their hyperspace drives engaging at the last possible moment. The grand fleet that was supposed to crush humanity had been destroyed with over 200 ships lost. The Zarkoni had never suffered such a devastating defeat in their entire history. Admiral Cole arrived at Frontier Station 3 hours after the battle ended, bringing reinforcements that were no longer needed. He surveyed the battlefield from the bridge of the Retribution, watching as recovery teams searched for survivors among the wreckage. There were few. Cole had known this battle was coming because the Zarkoni were predictable in their responses. They thought in terms of overwhelming force and direct confrontation. Humanity thought in terms of traps and misdirection, using the enemy's expectations against them. On his crippled flagship, War Leader Thrax sat alone in the dark command center and composed a message to the High Command. His hands shook as he recorded his report, and his voice carried emotions that Zarkoni warriors were not supposed to feel. He told them that the humans did not fight like any species the Zarkoni had encountered before. He said they fought with cunning and ruthlessness that seemed almost demonic. He said they anticipated Zarkoni tactics and countered them perfectly. He said they showed no mercy and gave no quarter. Most importantly, he said that the humans were not fighting to win territory or resources, but to exterminate, to erase the Zarkoni the same way the Zarkoni had erased so many others. The message reached the High Command, and for the first time in their civilization's history, the Zarkoni leadership felt genuine fear. They had believed themselves supreme and untouchable, the rightful rulers of their region of space. Now they faced an enemy that matched their ruthlessness and exceeded their capabilities. Emergency sessions were called and debates raged about how to respond. Some argued for immediate surrender while others demanded that they deploy their ultimate weapon, a device designed to destabilize stars themselves. Back at Frontier Station, Harper walked through the colony's main plaza, where families had gathered to celebrate their survival. Children played while adults hugged each other in relief. 300,000 people were alive because humanity had been prepared, because intelligence officers like Carter had done their jobs, because soldiers like Turner had struck at enemy supply lines, because defensive platforms had been built and positioned correctly. Harper felt tired down to her bones, but she also felt pride because they had protected these people. But Harper also knew that this was not the end. The Zarkoni would respond again, and their response would be even more desperate and dangerous. She had seen the intelligence reports about their planet-killing weapon, and she knew that Admiral Cole was preparing for that possibility. Humanity had won 2 major battles, but the war was far from over. The cost in lives and ships was mounting, and Harper wondered how much more they would have to sacrifice before the Zarkoni finally accepted defeat. She looked up at the stars and thought about all the species the Zarkoni had erased over centuries, species that never had the chance to fight back. Humanity was fighting not just for itself, but for all those vanished civilizations, carrying forward a message written in fire and fury that said some actions could never be forgiven, and some crimes demanded absolute justice. The Zarkoni High Command met in their deepest bunker beneath their capital city and made the decision that would seal their fate. They had lost at Thalos 4 and suffered catastrophic defeat at Frontier Station. Their grand fleet lay in ruins and their supply lines were collapsing under constant human raids. War Leader Thrax argued for surrender, for accepting defeat before more Zarkoni lives were lost. But pride overruled wisdom, and the High Command voted to deploy their ultimate weapon, the star killer that could destabilize suns and destroy entire solar systems. They would aim it at Earth itself and erase humanity's homeworld, forcing the humans to watch their species die before the Zarkoni accepted any peace. Intelligence Officer Daniel Carter intercepted the communications within hours of the decision. His deep space monitoring stations picked up coded transmissions that referenced the weapon and its deployment schedule. Carter sent an emergency message to Admiral Cole, marking it with the highest priority classification. The message reached Earth, and Cole read it 3 times to be certain he understood. The Zarkoni were going to try to destroy Earth, and they had the technology to do it. Humanity had perhaps 2 weeks before the weapon was ready to fire. Cole convened an emergency meeting with the military leadership and the civilian government. The room was filled with tension as he explained the situation. Some officials argued for evacuation, for abandoning Earth and scattering humanity across the colonies. Others demanded a negotiated peace, offering the Zarkoni anything they wanted to prevent the use of their weapon. Cole listened to all the arguments, and then he made his recommendation. Humanity would deploy Project Hellstorm. Dr. Karen Phillips entered the meeting room with physicist Alan Cooper, and together they explained what Hellstorm was. The weapon used quantum destabilization technology that could tear apart the fabric of space itself in a localized area. Once triggered, the effect would cascade outward until it consumed everything within approximately 1 light-year before burning itself out. It was the most destructive weapon humanity had ever conceived, so terrible that its very existence had been kept secret from all but the highest levels of command. Phillips explained that Hellstorm could only be deployed by a ship that flew directly into the target area, and that ship and its crew would be consumed by the weapon's effect. There would be no escape and no survival. The room fell silent as everyone understood what this meant. Using Hellstorm meant sacrificing a ship and everyone aboard to destroy the Zarkoni home system completely. It meant crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, committing an act of destruction on a scale that would make humanity feared across the galaxy. Cole looked around the room at the faces of leaders who had never imagined making such a choice. Then he asked the simple question of whether anyone had a better option. No one answered because there was no better option. The Zarkoni had forced this choice when they decided to erase New Terra, and now they had forced it again by threatening Earth. Cole gave the order to prepare Hellstorm for deployment. The UHS Apocalypse had been built in secret over the past 4 months, constructed specifically to carry Hellstorm to its target. The ship was essentially a massive delivery system wrapped around the weapon, with enough armor and weapons to fight its way through any defenses. Captain Steve Rogers was chosen to command the vessel because of his PID psychological profile, a man with the mental discipline to fly into certain death without hesitation. Rogers accepted the assignment without asking questions and began selecting his crew. Every member of the Apocalypse's crew of 800 was a volunteer who knew exactly what they were signing up for. There were no illusions and no false hope. They would fly into Zarkoni space, penetrate their defenses, reach the home system, and activate Hellstorm. Then they would cease to exist along with everything else within a light year. Engineering Officer Laura Mitchell signed on because her sister had died on New Terra. Weapons Officer Chris Morgan volunteered because he believed some threats had to be ended permanently. Navigator Julie Parker joined because she understood mathematics well enough to know that humanity's survival required this sacrifice. The Apocalypse departed Earth with no ceremony and no public announcement. Only Admiral Cole and a handful of others watched from Defense Command as the ship accelerated toward the hyperspace jump point. Cole felt the weight of what he had ordered settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. He was sending 800 people to their deaths, and he would carry that responsibility for whatever remained of his life. But he also knew that those 800 would save billions if they succeeded. The journey to Zarkoni space took 8 days, and Rogers used every moment to drill his crew. They practiced combat maneuvers until the responses became automatic. They ran simulations of the final approach until everyone knew their role perfectly. Rogers walked through every section of the ship, talking to crew members and making sure they understood the importance of what they were doing. He found no doubt or hesitation among them, only determination and a strange peace that came from accepting the inevitable. The Zarkoni detected the Apocalypse when it emerged from hyperspace at the edge of their territory. Defensive fleets moved to intercept, recognizing that this single human ship posed a threat even though they did not know what that threat was. Rogers ordered full speed ahead and the Apocalypse accelerated toward the heart of Zarkoni space. Enemy ships fired and the Apocalypse's shields absorbed the impacts while its weapons returned fire. The ship was built to take punishment and it shrugged off damage that would have crippled lesser vessels. Mitchell worked miracles in the engineering section, keeping the engines running at maximum output. Even as systems overheated and failed around her, she rerouted power and bypassed damaged circuits, using every trick she had learned in 20 years of service. The engine room became an inferno of heat and radiation, but she refused to leave her post. Morgan coordinated the weapon systems, firing plasma lances and missiles at anything that got too close. He cleared a path through the Zarkoni defenses, destroying ship after ship with cold precision. The Apocalypse took terrible damage as it fought deeper into Zarkoni space. Hull breaches vented atmosphere and entire sections were sealed off. Casualties mounted as crew members died at their stations. But the ship kept moving forward because everyone aboard knew they only had to survive long enough to reach the target. Rogers sat in his command chair and watched the tactical display as they approached the Zarkoni home system. The planet was beautiful from space, blue and green like Earth, with cities that glittered across the continents. Rogers thought about all the Zarkoni civilians down there who had no idea what was coming, who were just living their lives like the colonists on New Terra had been. The final Zarkoni defensive line threw everything they had at the Apocalypse. Energy weapons and missiles filled space and the ship's shields finally failed. Direct hits tore through the hull and more crew members died. But they were close enough now. Rogers gave the order to activate Hellstorm. Deep in the protected core of the ship, Dr. Cooper's weapon powered up for the first and last time. Reality itself began to scream as quantum fields destabilized. The effect was invisible at first, just a point in space where the laws of physics began to break down. Then the cascade started and the tear in space expanded outward. The Apocalypse was consumed first, the ship and its 800 crew members ceasing to exist in a fraction of a second. The tear continued to grow, reaching out to swallow the Zarkoni homeworld. The planet's surface simply vanished as the effect touched it. Billions of lives erased in an instant. The destruction spread to the other planets in the system, to the orbital shipyards and space stations, to the defensive fleets and supply depots. The cascade continued outward at an accelerating rate, consuming everything in its path. Zarkoni colony worlds throughout the home system disappeared. Military installations and civilian settlements alike were erased from existence. The effect reached its maximum extent of 1 light-year, and then finally began to collapse inward, the destabilized space-time healing itself. When it was over, there was nothing left but empty space where the heart of the Zarkoni collective had been. The scattered Zarkoni forces across the galaxy received the news within days as the few ships that had been beyond the weapons range reported what they had witnessed. The Zarkoni civilization was broken, their leadership gone, their home destroyed, their military scattered. Survivors fled in every direction, many of them falling victim to other species they had oppressed over the centuries. The Zarkoni collective ceased to exist as a unified power. Admiral Cole received confirmation that Hellstorm had succeeded, and he sat alone in his office, staring at the casualty report. 800 names, 800 people who had volunteered to die so that humanity might live. He added their names to the much longer list of those who had died on New Terra, and at Thalos 4 and Frontier Station, and in a dozen smaller engagements. The cost of survival had been paid in blood and sacrifice. The war was over. Humanity had won, but the victory felt hollow. Cole traveled to the memorial that had been built for New Terra, a vast wall carved with the names of all 50,000 colonists who had died there. New sections had been added for those who died in the war that followed. Cole stood before the wall and read names until his eyes burned. These were teachers and farmers and engineers, soldiers and sailors and pilots, people who had dreams and families and futures that had been stolen from them. In the years that followed, humanity's reputation spread across the galaxy. They became known not as explorers or diplomats, but as the species that had answered genocide with total war. Other civilizations learned what had happened to the Zarkoni, and they understood the lesson. Humanity could be peaceful and willing to cooperate, but threatening their colonies or their people would bring a response of overwhelming force. It was not a reputation humanity sought, but it was one they had earned. Cole retired from active duty and spent his remaining years ensuring that the names of the Apocalypse's crew were never forgotten. Monuments were built on every human world honoring Rogers and Mitchell and Morgan and the others who had flown into darkness, knowing they would never return. Their sacrifice became the foundation of humanity's new identity. A reminder that survival sometimes demanded terrible choices. New Terra was eventually resettled and renamed Memorial, a colony dedicated to remembering what had been lost and what had been sacrificed to avenge it. The purple sky and 3 moons hung over monuments to the dead, permanent reminders of the cost of both peace and war. Humanity looked to the stars with different eyes now, understanding that the galaxy held wonders and horrors in equal measure. They would explore and build and grow, but they would never again be caught unprepared. The silence of New Terra had been answered, and the echo of that answer would resonate across the galaxy for generations to come.